Hi, I'm Michael Joy. Welcome to our photo montage of Basic Silicone Mold Making 101. This is a chapter excerpt from a book I wrote called Confectionary Art Casting. It was my entry foray into the food shaping world that actually didn't exist before we got involved. It sounds pretty chest pounding to say that, but there just wasn't anybody at the time in 2003 that was doing this kind of stuff. There was a time when I was required to dress like a chef against my recommendation that I don't even know how to cook at all. In art school, I would have never thought that a guy who could barely make macaroni and cheese would be teaching world-class chefs how to do anything. In the day of making molds for the culinary industry, there's a few key people that recognized the potential early on, and they were eager to push forward this innovation in lectures, in other universities and events. And at the day, there was a big event. It was the biggest in the nation, World Pastry Team Championships. One year was the national championships, and then the next year it was the international championships. So it was like a qualifier, and then they would have these 13, 16 teams come from all over. In addition to the competition, they had a forum, which was called the Pastry Forum, in advance, and it was 5 days of educational classes. And they had big groups of people coming through. So you would have a class in the morning for 3 hours with one chef. You go to lunch, that was some exquisite thematic lunch that the hotel chef prepared. And then after lunch, you go to another demonstration. And then the next day you go see another 2 chefs. So by the end of the week, you saw 10 chefs, and they were typically famous chefs, well known around the world for something or another. I'm talking like the Jean-Marie Alboins, the Jackie Pfeiffers. In pastry, these guys were really well known. So if I were to rewrite this book, of course I would choose projects that were more relevant, but me and the chefs that I worked with, who were all globally famous, we just didn't know what to do, and we had 6 months to write this book before the World Pastry Team Championship and the World Pastry Team Forum was put in place, where I taught at an international crowd. So food shaping is something that's been with me since 2003, and I still have a business called Chicago Culinary Effects. That business originated as the Chicago School of Mold Making, but we got settled into mold making for chefs, and we kind of went to it. So there's a lot of stories about that. But today, 101. And when I made this sequence, I chose to use materials that were readily available globally, because this was going out to chefs around the world. And these days I would use some different materials, but let's get through it. All right, this is a bit of a test of my memory. This is what, 22 years ago. The model that we're working with is a cloisonné bell, which basically means it's a little metal bell that has been enameled on the surface. It's about 3.5 inches tall, and I'm gonna do 2 mold making processes with this. The first is just bing, bang, bung. We make a silicone mold, one and done. And then the second part of the process is I'm gonna show you how to make a master mold of this little piece here, in case you were someone who needed to scale for your own production, or perhaps you were selling some molds. Now, as always, there's a bunch of different ways to do this, but I tried to simplify this as best as possible. So here's the bell on a nice workboard, laminated top. The first thing that I need to do is to make sure this bell isn't gonna float. Because it's metal, I can jam in some oil-based clay and then shave off the bottom so it will sit flush on the workboard. Here I'm putting some Vaseline on the bottom of the oil clay. You can use Vaseline as an adhesive if you do it correctly. Basically, you take a glob of Vaseline and you stipple it onto the bottom of the clay. If you don't stipple it, it won't create a texture. If you brush it on, it's not as good. Here's why. You want that texture to act as suction when you push it down onto the workboard. And if you have too much Vaseline on there, it squishes out around the sides. So there's this beautiful balance to make this very clean, adhesive quality. Since I handled Vaseline, I want to make sure that I'm not leaving any imprints, fingerprints, on the metallic surface, the enameled surface. Remember, this mold was for chefs, and so even though I wouldn't make this type of mold for chocolate, at the time this is what it was for. And chocolate, if you can imagine making a chocolate casting that gives off a fingerprint, in the food world it just doesn't look good. So always make sure you're handling the model cleanly. Now, because this is going to be a one and done mold, I'm just taking a marker and I dropped it into a large hex nut, and I'm using this to create the border, the visual border around the organic shape of the bell base. You could imagine if I was going to build clay walls and I had an organic shape, the nut and pen is a great way to create an even line around the outside of a model. Since the diameter of the circle aligned very closely with the diameter of a red Solo cup, I decided to just use that as a quick mold box. However, if you're using the Solo cups, you need to make them doubled up so they're twice as strong, because when you put clay in the next steps around the base, you can compress the cup. Watch and see. So you notice I cut the top off of this cup. So what I've done is I've put the oil-based clay around the cup. Remember to warm up the clay in the microwave so that you're not cold compressing everything around and distorting the red cup. And now you have to level the workboard. You're only going to use 2 levels. You would either go north or south, east or west. So your board is tilted correctly. This silicone has not been de-aired in a vacuum chamber, and so the technique that you need to use is once you mix your base and your catalyst together, you have to pour in a thin stream. And we developed this technique years ago because I realized that chefs weren't going to have access to this equipment. So this is called needling. And when I wrote the book, we just started making up words for things that didn't exist before we put them down in pen. And the needling, what it does is you pour out, and that thin stream goes down into the mold box. And as it goes down, it's stretching out the air bubbles, and they burst. The majority of them burst before they enter the mold box. So since it would have been a little difficult for me to draw a pouring indication line within this cup, you can use your fettling knife or another tool after you've poured, and you can just touch the top of the bell and see how thick you have it, how thick the silicone is. You don't need more than 1/4 inch. This is a pretty bulky mold. This particular silicone that I was using was a Dow Corning material. I want to say it was Silastic E, but I just can't remember. At the time, there was not very much food contact safe materials available. It was a big challenge to find materials that were suitable for this. And this particular material suffered from what was called air inhibition. And that means that if I left any open surface on the top of a mold box, meaning I just poured in and there's the top part of the silicone is exposed to the air, that would stay tacky overnight. So I just used the cup to set it on top, and it seemed to not inhibit if there was something in contact with it. I don't think any of the materials that you'll use these days will have that trouble, but the Silastic line did. You got to let this cure for 24 hours. At least that's recommended. It'll tack up in 6, but give it overnight. What's the hurry? Just work on another project. And now I'm using a mud knife to release it from the workboard. I've taken the cup away, just use the knife and slice it off, and you're about to be done with this mold. The thing to do here is to remember that you had Vaseline at the bottom of the clay. And before you remove the clay, it's best to remove the Vaseline, otherwise the Vaseline will become incorporated into the clay recycling bin. Now I can push out the cloisonné bell from the silicone mold. It was a durometer of maybe Shore A40, and if you don't know what that means, it just means it was semi-firm. It was kind of a little less than a pencil eraser, but enough that I could push it out. And remember I said to pour 1/4 inch. If you can imagine, if I had 1 inch above it, not only is it a waste of material, but then that whole mold becomes like a brick, and it's just not necessary. You can use curved tip manicure scissors to trim the flash from molds. Flashing is inevitable with silicone mold making when you're making this type of project. And the flashing in the food world, you don't want small pieces of silicone that can crumble off into, let's say, your chocolate tempering machine or something else like that. The pair of scissors that I have here, I hadn't yet discovered the beautiful Fisker curved-tipped manicure scissors or craft scissors. So these were cuticle scissors, and they do the trick, but they get loose really quick. So I'll bring up a picture of the Fiskers. All right, here you have your finished model, cloisonné bell on the left, and the finished silicone mold on the right. And you can see that the shine has transferred from the metallic enameled surface into the silicone mold. And it's really terrific when this happens, because that shine can transfer into your food product. Now, if you were doing food casting, I mentioned earlier that I wouldn't do this for chocolate. There's a specific reason to do that. We'll put this maybe as an appendix in the end, but chocolate leaves a cocoa butter residue inside of silicone, and that eventually builds up and it dulls the shine of the casting. Whenever you're going to make a mold for chocolate and you want the shine, the best thing to do is to make a plastic mold, a PETG thermoformed, and we're going to get into that, but it's way down the line. This next sequence is a little bit more advanced, but it's still a very simple mold. This is going to be a master mold of the silicone mold that I make from the bell. It's a mold of a mold. It's a little bit of a word tangle, but you're going to get it pretty quick here. The difference is, because I'm making a master mold, I don't want to use round contoured shapes. I want to use squares and boxes, and it will become obvious as to why. We can kind of zoom past a few things here because you saw the basics. I'm going to prepare the cloisonné bell and affix it to the workboard. If you watched the plaster mold making videos, you saw that I created a 1-inch border. That was for plaster. There's special reasons for that. Silicone, you really only need 1/8 to 1/4 inch thickness on the side walls, otherwise you're starting to blow a lot of materials. You're already going to have a little bit of material inefficiency because the corners are going to be thicker material. Basically just draw this out with using a square. As I said, we've skipped a few steps here, but now I have built a mold box out of adjustable aluminum clink boards. Now for the book sequences, I built an acrylic clear mold wall in the front, and this is a pretty good way for you, someone watching this, to actually make clink boards themselves, because you can get pieces of acrylic and you can cut it nicely. And then in a future shot, you're going to see that I took a piece of L bracket and just double taped it to the side. It'll come up in better explanation. I'm pouring the silicone, same technique as before. Mix, needle, pour. Doesn't really matter where you pour. I haven't ever noticed a difference. The mold box has been completely removed. The silicone has cured, and now I'm using the manicure scissors to trim away the flash on all of the side corners. I've lifted the mold from the workboard, and now I have to finish cleaning up the mold. Since I'm going to be making a master mold, I'm not done. You see the similarities of how fast mold making can go, whether you use the cup or the box. It's like 1, 2, 3, and you're good. However, now I want to start making a mold of the green silicone mold, the mold of the mold. Here's a better shot of the homemade clink board that I was describing with that L bracket there. And it is important to remember to put the oil-based clay seal around any mold box that you build. There's some things that I'll forget to say moving forward because they're basic assumptions at the most basic mold making. Laminated workboard, fitted mold box, clamps, oil seal around it. So I might forget to say those things. All right, what I've done here is I've taken the finished silicone bell mold and I've inverted it so it's open face, cavity open facing up, and you can see the mold box around it. And I've tightened it around the silicone, and I've sealed it with clay. You have to be very careful not to compress the silicone with your clink boards so as not to distort the silicone. It's a tight but loose fit at the same time. If you're using this configuration, I would tighten the box down, clamp it, and then I would release the clamp to let the tension of the silicone push the mold box out. It's tight but not too tight. Here I've mixed up some hydrocal gypsum and I've pigmented it, and what I'm doing is I'm making what's called the core. The core of the master mold is basically the material that goes into the detail of the silicone mold. This happens to be the most critical part of making a master mold, because if you do not secure all of the detail inside of the mold, your master mold is going to be flawed, and that flaw is going to be carried forward in any future silicone mold that you pour. So you can see that I have a little chip brush in my hand, and after I've poured the hydrocal in, I'm using a chip brush to get this around. A fancier play would be a vibration table or something like that, but remember, this sequence was written with the idea in mind that not everybody had access to a lot of equipment. I also like to show that you can do really good mold making with very little equipment. Some videos that I've seen have all this great equipment, but it makes it feel like the process is prohibitively complicated. So here I am finishing, using the brush to carry the detail. Here I want to create a foot on the core. So I'm pouring about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch above the top of the silicone mold because I need that bell to sit on a plate. You'll see it in another shot. I'm going to let this cure or set. The mold box has been removed and you can see the plaster has flashed, which means flowed, down around the sides. Because I wasn't trying to compress it super tight, I knew this would happen, but it's a real easy cleanup. Use a Surform, shave off the hydrocal, chip off any extra plaster. You can turn it on its side and clean up some of the side flashing. You want to be very careful at this point not to separate the hydrocal from the silicone mold. This is undesirable. A master mold, you want to not remove all these pieces until you're done. What I'm doing here with the Surform is at one corner of the hydrocal plug, the core, I'm shaving a notch. This notch is going to let me orient the core in the future when I have the case around it. In ceramic terms, the core is called the block, and the case are the pieces that fit around the block, and they come together. We'll show you coming up. Because I'm going to be pouring more hydrocal that comes in contact with previously poured hydrocal, you have to create a barrier coat or what we call sizing the mold. I'm still using pottery soap to size the mold. You could use something else such as Murphy's oil or Vaseline. It wouldn't really matter at this point because you're not making a plaster slip casting mold. So it doesn't matter if the pores become permanently sealed. So I'm making sure to soap that notch and all of everything that you see pink. You have to do a couple coats of this. You put on the soap, you polish it in with the towel, and you repeat. You do it again. Now let me get a little more detail. You would suds up the soap on the hydrocal and you'd let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes to let it really draw into the plaster, which is porous, the hydrocal, and then you'd polish that down. You'll get a nice dull shine, and that's when you know you're in good shape. I'm repeating it. I show it, even though I could say repeating it, because I really want it to sink into the subconscious mold making mind. If I skip steps as a mold maker explainer, then those steps sound like they're not important. And people go, oh, well, I didn't really see that. But really, soaping these sections is critical. So I'm going to take the time to show them. I'm getting ready to pour 1/2 of the case. This is going to be, and you can see the black lines here, this is going to be like a L piece that is going to touch the workboard and cover 2 halves on diagonal of the silicone block. This is why I'm using a silicone mold that's a square. It's easier to do this part because it's all diagonal geometry. This is kind of an aerial view of the mold box that I've built around the core and the silicone mold to allow for the 3/4 inch spacing on the sides where the block is, where the case is going to be. I've pigmented the hydrocal green in this instance to show a separation. The silicone is a different green, you can see it in the center, and I'm flowing up to the top of the silicone mold. It's very important that you don't go up to the top and then over like you did with the core when you were covering the bell silicone mold. You only want to come to the top because this is actually going to be the open face of your master mold. I've removed the mold box and you'll notice it standing in the background. The reason that I put it in frame like this is that I took 2 clamps off of the mold box so that the measurement and the angle stayed the same, rather than taking all clamps off and setting it aside all flat broken down. Because I'm going to reuse this box, I want to keep the relative dimensions of it, and it ends up saving time later. It also aligns better with the plaster that I just poured. I'm expecting plaster flash, and that's what happens. So here I am scraping off the plaster flashing, and sometimes when you're building the case, you have to separate it, which is not ideal, but if you have to, I'll show you what to do. What I've done here is I've used the Sharpie marker for photographic purposes to show the division lines of each mold section. At the bottom, you see the pink core. In the center, you see the green silicone. And on the back center, outside, you see the green plaster hydrocal case. I think this was just an indicator that if the case came off of the block, you're going to see a little flash of plaster there. You have to be very careful not to remove that, because in fact that tiny little sliver is creating a tight seal for you within that piece. It'll all kind of express out towards the end, so hold that in mind. Now it's important, because I'm going to be pouring hydrocal on hydrocal, plaster on plaster, that I seal all of the surfaces of the plaster. This means everything. I may as well put a little more on the core. I'm going to put it all on the case. If the case had separated, I would have been soaping the inside of the case. The whole schmear gets sealed. Again, I'm showing the extra pictures because I want it to soak in. Remember to do even the top pieces of the hydrocal block and case. The back pieces, all very important. Now I've drawn, using the same spacer as I did before, I'm drawing the 3/4 inch space around the exterior of the block and case. And you'll notice on the lines that I'm meeting all of the edges of the block and case. That means the new piece that was poured has to also have plaster touching it. And in this instance, I don't need mold registration keys, because the block is what's going to keep it from coming out of alignment. Even though this is straight on all the sides, it will register snug. Now I'm reboxing this collection of core and one outside case. And you'll notice the spacing to allow for more plaster to be poured in. The box is sealed. I have a clamp out of the way for the picture. It looks like I wised up a little bit, but here we go. Here's the aerial view to show you the gap that I've created for the second case. I'm pouring the plaster hydrocal. Just if I say plaster, you know I mean hydrocal. My brain's looking at so many other things here. So now I'm pouring this plaster to come up to the top of the silicone. Don't go above it. Once that plaster section of the case has cured, I'm removing the flash again, cleaning it up. And before the hydrocal is completely set, it's your best idea to shave off the exterior sharp edges, and below me is a trash can. So I'm not just letting this crumb onto the floor. Why make a mess? So I'm just gonna shave, and I'm gonna take all of the exterior sharp pieces. The interior sharp points you do not want to shave, because you're actually gonna create gaps if you shave them, and your mold will leak. Keep your mold together and sure form it. Now I'm splitting the block and case, and you're gonna see it's a total of 3 pieces plus the silicone mold. Both cases are now separated, and you're seeing how it creates a mold of a mold. Now I can remove the silicone from the hydrocal core, and this is when I would be inspecting the core to see if I've made any mistakes or got any air bubbles. Highly detailed hydrocal plugs are very difficult to get correctly, because hydrocal is meant to be strong in chunky sections, not really this thready cloisonne. So if I were to do it these days, I would have made this master mold out of urethane resin. Here I'm taking away the top edge of the flash from the plug. That's the only part that I'm going to take away. I don't want to, this is the, you see my scraping tool, my shaving tool on the top. I don't want to do these side corners, because if I do, it creates an exit for the silicone to go down that shaved corner and out, because the case fits tightly around that plug, and I don't want to have any escape route possible. I put in an illustration of what not to trim, and if you made this type of mold, you would see that there is tiny raised ridges right along where these dotted lines on here. You see where I say do not trim this edge? Critical. I've used the Sharpie marker to outline the little key that I put in the base of the plug, and that is going to be registering nicely under my finger on the green piece in back. Well, in the corner there, it nests. Now I've put the plug, the core, back in position with the case, and now I'm going to close this back up. So now it's beginning to make sense. You've made a mold of a mold. And because it's hydrocal, you want it to dry. And if you don't strap it together tightly, it can warp and distort, and the seal comes not as pristine. So I'm going to strap this up with compression straps and let it dry. Here's a finished shot of your original silicone mold and your master mold, your block and case. Now, this is a hybrid technique of ceramics processes and silicone mold making processes. However, the thing that I would do is the mold that you see on the left is I would keep that in a safe place, and I would mark it OM, Original Master. And I would try not to use that very much because that has my highest level of quality. Because each time I make a block and case, no matter how good it is, it can lose some of its original luster. Here's an aerial view of the finished shot, just to help further explain the concept of a block and case. What I've done here is I'm applying Vaseline to the outside of the hydrocal. This is just to seal it up so that the silicone doesn't stick to it as much. I'm not going to put I'm not going to put Vaseline on the core or the center of the cloisonne bell detail. What we're about to do is to put everything back together, and we're about to pour silicone in it to make a duplicate mold. Now you'll notice I don't need any clink boards or clamps because the case I've built is a permanent fitted case that now it only fits this cloisonne bell plug. It's just one in itself, left foot, right foot. They just go together. Again, replacing the compression strap to make sure the silicone won't leak out. Here I'm preparing to fill the mold, the master mold, and I may as well cheat. So I've took the original mold and I put it on a scale and I weighed it, and I'm transferring that weight onto the exterior of the block and case. This way I'll always know how much silicone is needed to fill that mold. You wouldn't think it's a big deal, but at some point I was pouring 15 or 20 master molds at a time because I was selling molds, and I needed to know, oh, how big is my batch pour today, because the silicone was very expensive and I didn't want to waste it. Also, even though I'm not pouring silicone on this scale, it's a good habit to always get into saying put your scale in a bag so it keeps it clean. Now my scale was a little bit dirty, and then I learned, this must have been my learning moment of when I thought, well, these scales are $100 plus a pop, why am I killing them when I could help them survive? All right, here's the sequence of mixing silicone. This is pretty fast and simple. What I've done here is I've set up the station. I have a clean workspace. I have nothing really in my way that's going to knock stuff over. Anyways, I have a nice spatula that has a metal handle. I don't know if they're still available or not, but it's a nice durable mixing situation. It looks like the base is in the 5-gallon bucket and the catalyst is in the blue jug. And what I used to do for small amounts is I would just reach into the pail like honey and then dollop it into a mixing bucket. I don't do that anymore. I got smarter after this, and I used to take the whole silicone 5-gallon bucket from the cellar, and I would dump it into another bucket, which was literally a honey bucket, and they had a big valve on it, and I could keep those elevated, and then I could dispense the silicone very quickly. I have a picture of that. Also, for other silicones that I used a lot of, I took a utility sink, the plastic tubs with the 4 legs that you install, and on the drain I installed a valve. And that way I would load the sink with 10 or 15 gallons of base silicone, and then I would put a cover on it, and then that way I had a valve at the bottom that I could just dispense right onto a scale, and it was a great clean time saver. But for the book I hadn't thought of that yet. This silicone was very thick and I wanted to lower the durometer. So the component that I'm holding in my hand is a silicone fluid. It's a thinner, and I'm adding about 10% into the base, and then I'm going to mix that up. After I've mixed that up, I can add the catalyst. And that catalyst is the coming out of the blue jug here. It's nice that there was a pigment. Here I'm mixing everything together. The pigmented catalysts are very helpful. If it hadn't been pigmented, I would have added a little dash of iron oxide. But if you know you're going to be mixing and you really want to get a good mix, use a clear mixing bucket, because that translucent bucket that I have, I can hold up to the light and I can scrape the sides to see if I've left any marbling on the sides. The other thing is, on a small amount, you want to take your bucket and scrape the bottom. A lot of people don't do that, and they leave uncatalyzed silicone at the bottom of their bucket. Wear gloves, an apron, goggles. I want to show that I could have power mixed this, but I would only power mix if I have a vacuum chamber. The other thing is power mixing, with the metal paint blade that I have here, if you look closely at this picture and you zoom in, you'll see that I broke one of the blades off. And I also dulled the sharpness on those blades because they will, if you hold them in a plastic bucket, they will chew up the bucket and actually kick off little pieces of plastic, which I do not want in my silicone. So I've modified this mixing blade, and I'm going to let the silicone cake up onto it as time goes on, so it creates this rubber bumper for when I mix in the future and I don't chew up buckets. If you're using a mixing drill, you have to make sure you're not crashing onto your bucket. You got to kind of float it off the bottom, and then you can scrape it with a spatula. Drill mixing is best for big batches, not little batches. If you are committed to mixing with a drill, I highly recommend that your silicone go into a mixing container that has a handle, because those drills, especially with thick silicone, can really catch it and whip it, and then all of a sudden you have silicone splashing everywhere. All right, here we are. We're back at the beginning, except we're making a duplicate mold. So I'm needling into this block and case. And if you think about the sequence that I just told you, and you try to follow every one of them, don't do them all. I'm presenting options. I could have mixed with the spatula and then needled. I could have mixed with the drill and then de-aired and then poured into this without needling. So there's different options. I'm trying to compress them all together. If you do have a vacuum chamber and you're pouring your silicone, you don't have to pour it slow. You can lunk-a-dunk it right in there because it's already been de-aired, and pouring fast is only going to save you time. What I'm doing here is I'm cutting the batch on the pour, and you notice that there's still silicone left in the bucket. Here's what I want to do. I want to leave that in the bucket, stop my pour, set the bucket up again, and make sure that I scrape everything off of the sidewalls and the bottom and make sure that it's catalyzed. What often happens is people will leave unmixed, uncatalyzed silicone on the interior edge of their bucket, and then when they get to the end where they're nagging the pail, they start dragging in uncatalyzed material, and then it will cure, but it's not as strong. And remember, these were all for food-safe applications, so I wanted correct catalyzation. But you can get marbling in the silicone, and it's a sign of a lower quality food contact safe mold. Remember, back in the day, this Dow Corning Celastic material had air inhibition, so I took a piece of wax paper and I set it on top of the wet silicone in order that it may cure. I don't think you'll have to do this unless you use the Dow material. What I've done is I've inverted the whole block and case 24 hours later. Of course, I would let the silicone set. I mean, I shouldn't have to say it. But the mold has been inverted, and now I can very delicately separate each section. You want to be careful when you're separating a hydrocal block and case, because if you chip through it again and again and again, gradually your block and case is going to lose its tight seal. Here I am extracting the core or the plug from the duplicate silicone mold. So the last picture here is where I'm trimming up the silicone mold out of the block and case. And you could imagine if you were selling these molds, if you had many master molds, you could produce with one mix and pour many duplicate molds. Or if you don't and you're making on demand, someone says, oh, I need a bell mold. Well, you don't have to start from scratch. You know that you've invested your time and money in making a master mold, and you can go pull it off the shelf, boom, and make one and send it out the door, and you don't have to keep inventory. This is a great recommendation if you have a small shop. It's what we used to do, was keep very low inventory. So thank you for watching. We're gonna get into some real advanced mold making, and this is just baby steps, so stay with us.